As the evidence continued to pile up, researchers realized something unexpected. Type O blood alone couldn't tell the entire story. It was only one piece of a much larger genetic puzzle. In 2025, scientists analyzing ancient and modern DNA samples uncovered new links between migration, adaptation, and the genetic history of indigenous populations across the Americas. Before we uncover what these discoveries reveal about our forgotten genetic past, make sure to subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. Because the next chapter reveals how a tiny genetic marker inside our blood connects to a story stretching back more than 15,000 years. To understand why type O blood became so dominant across the Americas, scientists had to travel back, not through time, but through the genetic code written inside human DNA itself. October 17, 2025, 8:42 p.m. Inside a climate-controlled genetics laboratory, rows of high-performance sequencing computers hummed quietly as thousands of ancient DNA fragments appeared across massive digital displays. Every sequence represented someone who had lived thousands of years ago. Every mutation, every inherited marker, was another sentence in humanity's forgotten history. Two researchers sat in silence, staring at the latest reconstruction. Dr. Elena Ramirez leaned toward the monitor without taking her eyes off the screen. "Run the comparison again," she said softly. "Overlay the ancient Beringian genomes with the indigenous American samples and filter out every mutation younger than 10,000 years. Dr. Michael Chen frowned. "I've already run it 3 times. "Run it again." A few seconds later, colored genetic pathways spread across the display like glowing rivers. Michael slowly shook his head. "No, that's impossible." Elena looked at him. "What is it?" "The pattern isn't changing." She folded her arms. "It should." "It isn't." Silence filled the room. Finally, Michael zoomed into the ABO gene. "Look at this." The screen highlighted one small section of chromosome 9. The O allele isn't appearing independently across these populations. He enlarged the timeline stretching from Siberia into Alaska. "It's being inherited from the same ancient founder population." Elena's eyes narrowed. "So we're not looking at repeated evolution." Michael nodded. "We're looking at inheritance." She stared at the map. "That would explain why the same genetic signature survives from Alaska all the way to Patagonia. It would also explain why the surrounding DNA is nearly identical." Neither scientist spoke for several moments. Outside, rain tapped softly against the laboratory windows. Finally, Elena broke the silence. "How old is the oldest sample carrying this sequence?" Michael typed rapidly. "Approximately 15,000 years." She looked again. "And the youngest?" "Modern indigenous populations." She slowly leaned back in her chair. "So the lineage never disappeared." "It didn't. It survived almost unchanged." Michael nodded. Generation after generation. For a moment, neither scientist seemed interested in the blood type itself anymore. What they were seeing was something far larger, not simply a medical characteristic, a surviving genetic fingerprint, a direct biological connection linking modern indigenous communities to some of the earliest people who entered the Americas. Michael opened another window displaying migration routes, reconstructed from ancient DNA. "You see these branches?" Elena nodded. "They spread in every direction." "Exactly. North, south, along the Pacific coast, into the Amazon." They separated geographically, but they kept carrying the same ancestral O lineage. Elena smiled. "So every migration carried a copy of the same genetic story." Michael looked thoughtful. and every generation preserved another chapter. The laboratory clock quietly changed to 9:17 p.m. Neither scientist noticed. They were already examining another data set. Ancient genomes recovered from sites across Siberia had begun aligning with newly sequenced remains from Alaska. The software connected them automatically. One glowing line after another stretched across the screen. Thousands of years disappeared in seconds. Elena whispered almost to herself, "We're watching an Ice Age migration happen inside a computer." Michael nodded, and the DNA remembers every step. He zoomed further into the analysis. The interesting part isn't that type O became common. It's when it became common. He highlighted several population bottlenecks, small founding groups, extreme isolation, very little outside gene flow. Elena immediately understood. So genetic drift amplified what those first communities already carried. Exactly. And once populations expanded across 2 continents, the frequency exploded. She looked back toward the enormous migration map. So maybe the biggest mystery was never why indigenous Americans have so much type O blood. Michael smiled. Maybe the mystery was why we expected anything else. The room fell silent once more. Outside, the storm had stopped. Inside, millions of DNA sequences continued moving across the monitors, each one carrying a tiny fragment of humanity's oldest journey. For years, scientists had searched for a single dramatic answer. Instead, what they found was something even more remarkable. Not one discovery, not one migration, not one isolated event, but thousands of generations preserving the same biological signature across an entire hemisphere. And that realization was beginning to change far more than the history of blood. It was changing the history of people themselves. It's a meaningful piece of who they are. March 18th, 2025, 10:46 a.m., inside the ancient genomics laboratory, dozens of genome maps glowed across a wall of ultra-high-resolution displays. Ancient DNA extracted from archaeological sites in Alaska, Western Canada, the Great Plains, the Andes, and the Amazon was being compared simultaneously. Every colored line represented thousands of inherited genetic markers. Somewhere inside those patterns, researchers hoped to reconstruct one of humanity's oldest family trees. Dr. Elena Ramirez slowly rotated a 3-dimensional population map floating above the laboratory table. "Look at this." Dr. Michael Chen walked closer. "The migration branches?" "No." She highlighted several communities separated by thousands of miles. "The shared ancestry." Michael leaned forward. "They shouldn't be this similar." "They are." He enlarged the genetic comparison. Ancient genomes recovered from northern Alaska aligned with DNA inherited by communities living thousands of miles farther south. The percentages changed, the populations changed, the centuries changed, but the inherited markers continued appearing. Michael smiled quietly. "It's like following the same family across an entire continent." Elena nodded. "Not one family. Thousands!" The DNA isn't just showing where people lived. It's showing who stayed connected. The room became silent. For decades, archaeologists had relied on stone tools, pottery fragments, and burial sites to reconstruct the past. Now, DNA was doing something archaeology alone never could. It was revealing invisible relationships, connections between people who never wrote histories, but carried those histories inside every cell of their bodies. Michael opened another sequence. This marker appears again. "Where?" "Montana." Elena looked surprised. It was already in the Yukon sample. "And now it's showing up in Peru." She folded her arms. "Thousands of miles apart." thousands of years apart, but genetically connected. Neither scientist spoke for several moments. The realization settled slowly. Migration wasn't simply people moving across landscapes. It was generations carrying the same biological story into entirely new worlds. At 11:08 a.m., another notification appeared on the laboratory display. A fresh comparison had finished processing. Ancient maternal lineages, ancient paternal lineages, autosomal DNA. Every dataset pointed toward the same conclusion. Michael looked almost amused. "We keep asking whether these communities were related." Elena smiled. "The DNA keeps answering the same way." "Yes." He pointed toward the expanding migration map. "The distances fooled us. The genetics didn't." Every new genome strengthened the picture. Communities separated by deserts, mountain ranges, ice sheets, and tropical forests still carried evidence of shared ancestry stretching back to the first migrations into the Americas. "This," Elena whispered, "isn't just ancestry testing." Michael nodded. "It's a reconstruction of human memory." She looked at another visualization. "What amazes me most isn't what changed. It's what survived." He understood immediately. Languages evolved, cultures adapted, technologies transformed, empires rose, empires disappeared. But tiny sections of DNA quietly passed from parent to child without interruption. Generation after generation, century after century, for more than 15,000 years. Michael turned toward another screen displaying dozens of family trees reconstructed from modern DNA databases. "You realize what this means?" Elena nodded before he finished. People searching for their ancestry today aren't just finding relatives. They're rediscovering migrations. They're rediscovering civilizations. They're rediscovering themselves. Outside the laboratory windows, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the glass. Inside, millions of genetic markers continued aligning automatically. No headlines, no dramatic announcements. Just quiet evidence, patient evidence. The kind that accumulates one genome at a time until history itself begins to look different. For the scientists watching those sequences unfold, ancestry was no longer simply a question of names or family records. And families who had unknowingly carried those memories across an entire hemisphere for thousands of years. That realization set the stage for one of the most unexpected conversations in modern genetics. November 6th, 2025, 7:38 p.m. Deep inside an ancient DNA laboratory, two evolutionary geneticists stood in front of a digital wall displaying genomes from modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. Thousands of colored markers connected one population to another like glowing threads stretched across tens of thousands of years. Every new sequence added another piece to humanity's forgotten family tree. Dr. Elena Ramirez broke the silence first. "You know what surprises me?" Dr. Michael Chen looked up from the sequencing results. "That we're all still carrying them?" Elena smiled. "No. That we spent centuries talking about Neanderthals as if they were strangers." Michael nodded. "When genetically, they were family." A new analysis appeared on the center display. Small sections of Neanderthal DNA illuminated inside dozens of modern human genomes. Some people carried a little more, some a little less. But the pattern was unmistakable. Michael pointed toward one highlighted chromosome. This sequence survived 40,000 years. Elena looked closely, generation after generation. Without anyone even knowing it was there. She leaned against the laboratory desk. "It changes the question." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What question?" "We've always asked why Neanderthals disappeared." She paused. "Maybe we should also ask, how much of them never actually disappeared? For several seconds, neither scientist spoke. The computers continued processing ancient genomes in complete silence. Michael finally answered, "Not all extinction is absolute." Elena nodded. "Sometimes populations disappear, but pieces of them survive inside another." The realization hung quietly in the room. History suddenly looked less like replacement and more like inheritance. At 8:01 p.m., another reconstruction finished processing. The software displayed a timeline beginning nearly 500,000 years ago. Different human populations separated, adapted, migrated, met again. Sometimes they competed, sometimes they cooperated, and occasionally they had children together. Michael watched the animation carefully. "This isn't a straight line." "It never was." Elena smiled. "It's a network." "Exactly. Branches separating, then reconnecting. Again and again." He enlarged one section of the timeline. "Look. The genomes don't show isolated species living on separate planets. They show neighboring populations sharing landscapes for thousands of years." She studied the overlapping migration routes, which means ideas may have traveled too. Michael nodded. Tools, skills, possibly language, maybe even traditions. Neither scientist claimed certainty. The archaeological evidence remained incomplete. But every new discovery suggested ancient human groups were far more behaviorally complex than researchers once imagined. Elena turned toward another display showing stone tools recovered from multiple archaeological sites. Once, people looked at these artifacts and assumed only modern humans could have made them. Michael looked at the corresponding genetic evidence. Now we know the answer isn't so simple. She quietly replied, "History rarely is." Outside the laboratory, the evening sky had grown dark. Inside, thousands of ancient DNA fragments continued assembling into complete genomes. Each successful reconstruction erased another old misconception. Not through speculation, not through mythology, but through evidence. Michael crossed his arms. The strangest part isn't discovering that Neanderthals were intelligent. It's realizing how much our assumptions shaped the questions we asked. Elena agreed. For decades we looked for proof that they were primitive. She glanced back toward the screen. When we should have been asking how similar they were to us. The laboratory fell silent again. Somewhere inside those genomes were traces of shared ancestors who had lived through ice ages, volcanic winters, changing climates, and migrations that stretched across continents. They hunted, raised children, buried their dead, adapted to impossible environments. And although their populations eventually faded from the fossil record, their genetic legacy did not vanish completely. It continued quietly, inside millions of people living today. For the scientists studying those sequences, the discovery carried an unexpected lesson. Human evolution wasn't simply the story of one successful species replacing another. It was the story of repeated encounters, shared ancestry, and genetic echoes that still survive inside us, reminding us that the boundary between them and us has never been as clear as history once imagined. Crawford's DNA, December 2nd, 2025, 9:14 a.m. The sequencing room at the Cellular Research Institute was unusually quiet. On one wall, a massive digital display traced thousands of genetic markers across continents and millennia. Every few seconds, another chromosome aligned with an ancient genome recovered from archaeological sites across North America and Siberia. Researchers had spent months examining Crawford's DNA, expecting to confirm family history. Instead, the data was beginning to tell a much larger story. Dr. Elena Ramirez stared at the latest comparison. "It finally finished," Dr. Michael Chen walked over, carrying a tablet filled with population models. So? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she enlarged a section of chromosome 9. The ancestry matches what we'd expect from someone with deep Blackfeet roots. Michael nodded. That's reassuring. It is. She paused. But that's not the surprising part. He looked closer. What am I missing? Elena highlighted several ancient genetic markers. These segments don't stop in Montana. They continue north. Michael followed the glowing pathways. Into Alberta. She nodded again. And farther west. The digital map expanded across Alaska before stretching toward northeastern Siberia. Michael slowly exhaled. So the connections never really disappeared. They were always there. They were simply waiting for enough ancient genomes to reveal them. The laboratory fell silent. For years, researchers had relied on isolated archaeological discoveries. Now thousands of ancient DNA samples were beginning to connect those discoveries into one continuous genetic landscape. Michael looked back at Crawford's results. This isn't rewriting his family history. It's expanding it. Elena smiled. Exactly. Crawford isn't unusual. He's connected. Connected to generations that survived migrations, climate change, and thousands of years of history. At 9:41 a.m., another notification appeared. The Ancestry software had finished comparing Crawford's genome against newly sequenced ancient remains from Beringia. Several regions matched expected indigenous American ancestry. Nothing surprising there. But the surrounding genetic patterns revealed something researchers had only recently begun to appreciate. Migration into the Americas had been more complex than simple arrows on a map. Populations separated, reconnected, adapted, expanded. Sometimes remained isolated. Sometimes exchanged genes with neighboring groups. Michael folded his arms. The old diagrams made it look like one straight migration. Elena laughed quietly. Human history is almost never that simple. She rotated the migration model. People moved. They stopped. They split into smaller communities. They met other groups. They adapted to completely different environments. The DNA records every one of those decisions. Michael watched thousands of colored pathways crossing the screen. It's less like one road, and more like an entire network. Outside the laboratory windows, snow drifted across the parking lot. Inside, the computer quietly reconstructed thousands of years of ancestry from fragments invisible to the human eye. Eventually, Michael turned back toward Crawford's profile. You know what I find most remarkable? What? This started with one person's DNA. Elena nodded, and ended with an entire population history. She zoomed out until modern individuals and ancient genomes appeared together on the same display. No genome exists in isolation. Every person carries pieces of countless generations. Every chromosome remembers people whose names history forgot. The room remained silent, not because the mystery had been solved completely, but because every answer seemed to uncover an even older question. Michael broke the silence. We've learned more about migration. We've learned more about ancestry. But one question still refuses to disappear. Elena already knew which one he meant. The type O mystery. He nodded. Generation after generation, population after population. It remains overwhelmingly dominant throughout indigenous communities across the Americas. She opened another database containing ABO blood group sequences collected from ancient and modern populations. The founder effect explains part of it. So does isolation, and probably natural selection. Michael looked unconvinced. But not all of it, she agreed. There are still pieces missing. Michael closed the ancestry map and opened a folder labeled historical accounts. It isn't just genetics that's interesting. It's the stories. Elena raised an eyebrow. The oral traditions? He nodded. For generations, many communities preserved stories about distant visitors, migrations, and encounters. She smiled cautiously. They're important cultural histories, but they aren't genetic evidence. Exactly. We shouldn't confuse the two. He closed the file. The science has to stand on the DNA. The traditions stand on their own. So the mystery isn't really about finding one dramatic answer. Michael smiled. It's about understanding how thousands of ordinary generations created extraordinary genetic patterns. Outside, the snowfall continued. Inside, another ancient genome finished processing. Another small piece of humanity's story quietly took its place beside the rest, reminding the researchers that history is rarely written all at once. More often, it is reconstructed one fragment, one genome, and one generation at a time. Lake Baikal, the ancient gateway of human migration. January 14, 2026, 6:52 p.m. In a research facility overlooking the frozen landscapes of Siberia, a team of geneticists and archaeologists gathered around a massive digital map of Eurasia. At the center of the display was a place that had fascinated scientists for generations. Lake Baikal, the deepest freshwater lake on Earth, a place surrounded by mountains, ancient forests, and thousands of years of human history. Dr. Elena Ramirez studied the migration model appearing on the screen. People think of Lake Baikal as just a natural wonder. She pointed toward the glowing genetic pathways. But genetically, it's something much bigger. Dr. Michael Chen nodded. It's a crossroads. Exactly. For thousands of years, different populations passed through this region. They exchanged technology. They exchanged culture. And they exchanged genes. The researchers weren't simply studying a lake. They were studying a meeting point between ancient worlds. Archaeological evidence showed that humans had occupied areas around Lake Baikal for tens of thousands of years. The region became a place where different groups adapted to extreme climates, developed new survival strategies, and created communities capable of enduring some of the harshest environments on Earth. Michael enlarged the timeline. Look at the dates. Elena leaned closer. Upper Paleolithic, then Mesolithic, then Bronze Age. He nodded. Generation after generation. Different cultures, but the same landscape. The significance was clear. Lake Baikal was not just a place people lived. It was a place where human history repeatedly crossed paths. For decades, scientists studying the origins of Native American populations focused heavily on the idea that ancient people moved from Siberia into Alaska through Beringia during the last ice age. That migration remains one of the strongest explanations for how humans reached the Americas. But ancient DNA was revealing a much more complicated picture. Human movement was not a single journey. It was a series of migrations, a network of movements, a story of populations separating, reconnecting, and adapting over thousands of years. Michael looked at the genetic map. So the people near Lake Baikal weren't just isolated communities. No. Elena highlighted several shared genetic markers. They were part of a much larger human story. The laboratory lights reflected across the screen as ancient genomes appeared one after another. Some came from Siberian hunter-gatherers. Others came from early populations connected to Native American ancestry. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Michael whispered, "The past is closer than we think." Elena nodded. Because it never completely disappeared. Every human population carries echoes of earlier generations, a mutation, a genetic pattern, a trace of a journey made thousands of years ago. And in places like Lake Baikal, those traces are especially powerful, because the region preserved evidence of repeated human encounters, not just movement, connection. At 7:24 p.m., the researchers examined another set of ancient samples. The results showed something unexpected. The genetic relationship between Siberian populations and Native American ancestors was not a simple parent-to-child connection. It was the result of long-term population history, small groups, changing environments, periods of isolation, and moments of contact. Michael looked at the model. So the ancestors of Native Americans weren't simply traveling across a bridge.